Hi there, and welcome to this LaborOnline, Labor and Working Class History Association um, book profile of a fascinating edited collection that we'd love members to learn about. We've got two very distinguished scholars with us here today. Dr. Elissa Sampson is an urban geographer who studies how the past is actively used to create new spaces of migration, memory, heritage, and activism. She has pursued a lifelong interest in migration, diaspora, re-diasporization, and immigrant culture on New York's Lower East Side, Brooklyn, and Paris, making visible dynamic interactions among diasporas in shared spaces and places. As a research associate in Cornell University's Jewish Studies program, Dr. Sampson worked extensively with Cornell's Kiel Center, confiscated Cold War archives on the International Workers' Order, or the IWO, including their partial digitization. She co-organized a public online academic conference, De Linke, or the Left, based largely on its archival Jewish section holdings. Dr. Sampson has taught labor and gender history, including the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, its memorialization, and relationship to current labor activism. She is the co-editor and contributor to a new book about the IWO, which we're going to be profiling in this discussion today. Her co-editor is Dr. Robert Zecker. Robert Zecker, or Bob Zecker, is a professor of history at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, Canada, where he teaches courses in race, immigration, social movements, and U.S. history. His research includes immigration, radicalism, and the popular culture of immigrants on the left. He is the author of many articles in journals such as the Journal of American Ethnic History, the Journal of Transnational American Studies, and American Communist History, and is also the author of 5 books, most recently A Road to Peace and Freedom, The International Workers' Order, and the Struggle for Economic Justice and Civil Rights, 1930 to 1954, from Temple University Press. And he has a chapter, Spotlight on Jim Crow, Radical Immigrant Papers, Cover Race and Civil Rights in Immigration and Exile, the Foreign Language Press in the UK and US, going to be published with Bloomsbury. He's currently writing a history of the Communist Party's workers' schools called Training for the Class Struggle. And before entering the academic racket, Bob was an ink-stained wretch foisting journalism on an unsuspecting public in his native New Jersey. And I believe we have someone from New Jersey in Bob's case, and in Elissa's case, someone from New York. So it'll be a great dynamic for our discussion today. And the discussion, of course, is about the book From Popular Front to the Cold War, the Interracial Left and the International Workers' Order from 1930 to 1945, edited by both Elissa and Bob. I should also introduce myself. My name is Ian Rocksborough-Smith. I'm an associate professor of history, primarily U.S. history, and I teach at the University of the Fraser Valley. I'm also an online editor with the LaborOnline blog with the Labor and Working Class History Association. And so we're really glad to have both Elissa and Bob with us today to talk about their great new edited collection and the many fascinating studies that are a part of that collection that really animate the history of the International Workers' Order. So I think to get started, and I'd like to hear from either of you to begin, but what was it that drew you to studying the IWO? I know in both your cases you have a depth of research on the subject, as well as other aspects, for example, of the radical left in America, and histories of immigration, but what drew you directly to the IWO?
In my case, and again, it's a little different from what Bob, I do interest myself in what you might call the erstwhile immigrant left, sometimes referred to as the new immigrants, those who came basically in a time period in which they were racialized and had a trajectory. They were typically Jewish, Italian, Slavic. There's enormous literature on them because they're seen as unassimilable to a large degree. I would call them racialized. And sometimes the literature is explicitly racial about them. There's nothing like a Siciliano to attract the Dillium Commission's attention. Having said that, I found myself at Cornell one day and got a third email from the library saying that they were extending a deadline for digitization for digital humanities for a grant. And so I was sitting there and ignoring the usual university emails. And someone said to me, "You know what that means, Elissa. They haven't found a good grant. What would you do if you had one?" I said, "Oh, I would go for the confiscated archive, of course." And they said, "The what?" And I said, "Oh, the International Workers' Order and the Jewish People Fraternals Order. When it was shut down, their archives were confiscated and given to Cornell University by New York State. And really, it's never been digitized. People don't really know what these people thought. They simply knew they disappeared with the Cold War." And so I went to the Kiel Center, spent a month doing a spreadsheet and writing a grant application. And yes, I was able to digitize and then sort of plunged in even more thoroughly.
Yeah, for me, I guess why I became interested in the IWO is previous work I was looking at immigrant groups, chiefly Slavic, because those are the languages I can read, a little Italian, but didn't pay attention to my mom's dad as much as I should have when he spoke it. So earlier work was looking at how white ethnics, quote, became white. And a large part of it was in immigrant newspapers and other social, cultural productions, how they began to depict or characterize Blacks. And you could say pretty predictably, right, and this is very broad, Poles, Slovaks, etc., learned to become white by buying into the American white Black racial binary. When I was doing that research, though, I kept seeing little in the corner of my eye, metaphorically, references to the left press and to the International Workers' Order, which I really didn't know what it was then. This is going back, wow, 12 years, 13, 14 years, and said, I better look into this group because they seem to be pretty good on interracial activism and solidarity and many other things. So that's my initial entry point into the IWO, and found that they had the archives at Cornell that Elissa mentioned, some papers at the phenomenal NYU Wagner Tenement Library, etc. But it was sort of like, as I'm finishing one project, what am I going to do next? And here's a group that did not buy into the American celebration of whiteness as much as more quote unquote mainstream white ethnic East Europeans, Southern Europeans did. So that's how I've discovered the IWO myself.
And when
Great.
we discovered it, both of us understood very rapidly that by 1932, these Yiddish speakers who were part of the Yiddish-speaking left and founded a fraternal organization, which, as we know, is a sort of fuddy-duddy type of organization. In terms of American history, typically, because it's a benefits society, mutual aid, we realized very rapidly they wanted to amalgamate with other stranded immigrants and with Black nationalists. So these archives were a delight, a revelation, and neither of us regrets our time in them.
Great. Yeah, no, it's fascinating to learn about both of your approaches to the subject, and to think about the sort of the importance of the IWO as well to understanding the interracial left in American history. And it's just remarkable too that it's taken until this point for scholars to really kind of reckon with it. And I'm sort of curious as to how you both see it as a vehicle for understanding the broader history of the interracial left, because there's many studies that have been done now for decades, thinking about, for example, the history of the American Communist Party and its relationship with the African American freedom struggle, and dealing with anti-racism, and there's of course the history of the CIO and its unions, and the left unions particularly, that were impacted by the Cold War, and the history of the long civil rights movement in general, and its connections to the evolution or devolution, if you will, of the American left through the 20th century. So I'm just wondering how you each see the IWO kind of fitting into that longer story.
Well, a lot of the people in this organization, there's kind of an overlap in the organizations you meant. Most of them were working class to some degree. I mean, there were members who were, to be crudely Marxist, petty bourgeois, shopkeepers, accountants, whatever. But an overwhelming number of them were in the industries that started to unionize, or effectively through the CIO. And as a matter of fact, the IWO leaders had letters congratulating them from people like Philip Murray, of course, the president of the CIO, because they were also organizers for this group. And it's amazing, the CIO, that is. It's amazing, too, a woman named Louise Thompson Patterson, who Elissa and I have a chapter in the book writing about, who was a communist, an African-American woman. She also helped organize for the CIO in the late 30s, courtesy of the IWO. She'd organized IWO lodges. And then, well, what do you know, in Western Pennsylvania, they were Croatian or Slavic steelworkers. So they began using these branches of the IWO as places to pass out literature for the CIO. And Louise herself, being A, African-American, and B, a woman, in her unpublished memoirs, says, I was worried going in there. Are these, Polish men, Ukrainian immigrant men, going to take orders from a Black woman? No, but there was a confluence and a recognition. And I don't mean to wash away the differences between race and ethnicity, but in the context of being poor and denigrated by mainstream quote unquote society in the 1930s, people in the IWO said, no, we're in this fight together. I see it as the IWO story, that is, as a piece of the puzzle. It's not the only group, and it's important to remember, other organizations on civil rights activism, unionization battles. But this group that we wrote about, it was there on the fight, on most of the struggles in the 30s, 40s, 50s, until, of course, they were McCarthyized. We'll get to that later, right? And by the way, I think a big reason they were stigmatized was because of their interracial activism. I think most people know most of the heads of HUAC, or the Senate Committee on Subversive Organizations, were Southern segregationists. And, they weren't crazy about an organization that was interracial in its membership and was also advocating for Black civil rights in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s.
I would add to this that the commitment to labor was absolutely built into the IWO and its founding, in part because it's founded by garment workers primarily, and they're poor, and eventually they will include Clara Lemlich Shavelson, who some may remember from the strike of 1909 or the uprising of the 20,000. And she leads a meat boycott with other women in Harlem in the 30s. And you have Jewish and Black women working together. But we also have tons of literature showing the work with CIO unions, and that there's a sense that the purpose of the IWO, because it's an amalgamated society in every sense. It has multiple sections, and by the time we finish, we're going to get to 16 sections. And I call English the lingua franca plus. So Bob and I both admit the IWO could be a little bit challenging, if you will, from a linguistic point of view. But having said that, the commitment to labor and to the CIO unions is very deep. I find myself knee deep some days with Louis Weinstock from the Painters Union or Ben Gold from the Furriers. But also we have the steel workers. So it's both the big, well-known industrial unions as well as perhaps today the less well-known unions. And to the earlier point you made, of course, we're in the debt of everybody who has researched the CP and its antecedents in the 20s and early 30s. But having said that, this is not the CP. This is a fraternal organization whose leadership was in the CP orbit, but its membership, 90% of them were not CP members. So there are real distinctions here that we have to understand in terms of agency and constraints and interests. But having the CIO unions be backed was a natural for all of them.
Right. Yeah. And I think if I recall in the study, you mentioned it's upwards of only about 10% of members were involved in the CP, right? And and I think that point you're making there, Elissa, too, about what type of organization it was too. Like it's a fraternal order. And in that sense, it suggests there's all kinds of other functions it would have had, that extended beyond what a labor union would do necessarily, even though there were obviously strong connections with labor. But as an institution, I wonder if you could each speak a little bit about, how the IWO functioned in terms of its, day-to-day efforts, in the different chapters that existed, of course, across the country. I'm thinking about sort of mutual aid functions and things that, would have attracted members who were not necessarily explicitly politically inclined, but, thinking about the context of the Great Depression, which, the IWO really kind of increased and served a really important purpose to so many Americans.
So if you'll permit me, and Bob will elaborate on this, we did spend time with our book's editor explaining how important it was to poor immigrants and to African Americans to be able to bury their dead and do it with dignity and not have the type of insurance policies that refuse them entirely or marked up benefits. These benefits, life insurance, health insurance, TB screening, burial benefits, were absolutely central to these IWO members, and the people who solicited IWO members took no markup in doing this. So these benefits are pretty much at cost. And if you know anything about actuarial tables, and I happen to know something about them, you can see that they're actually extraordinarily well funded in terms of reserves and very careful the way one wants an actuary to be in balancing books. So doing this was a real risk because you never know with populations that get insured what will happen in advance. And making sure that people had access to those benefits was critical. Having said that, you get evicted, no worries. Your eviction committee, they're on your block. They move you back in. There's tons of stuff they do, including in the Allerton Avenue coops, because they don't say co-ops, they say coops. It has to do with Yiddish. It's the Bronx. They have cooperative stores, and they're trying to deal with the dairy farmers, and they're trying to do a kindergarten, and they're trying to do all sorts of other things. The stuff that survives the Depression is really the reading room and some of the language groups and the kids clubs. But you can see early in the Depression, they're trying to figure out how to subsidize things that really can't be quite subsidized, but they're doing everything. I mean, really, it's admirable, and it gives us a model for how people step up in times of need and form new associations, including singing ones.
Yeah, and it might seem today that this is almost, and we had this question from our editor when we wrote about a lot of these benefits, the need for healthcare insurance, accident policies, death benefit societies. The IWO had cemeteries, right? And he said, well, this is pretty, peripheral. Why are you stressing this? And I think a lot of people today in America, or certainly Canada, don't see this as vital. But in 1930, as we know, right, pre-Social Security, old age pensions, accident workman compensation legislation, people were in destitution. A lot of the other fraternal societies in ethnic communities were going bankrupt in 1930. So the IWO stepped in, and as Elissa said, right, it was run on a no cost basis, or the phrase that they used was, there's no Jim Crow in the IWO, so African Americans did not have higher rates for inferior insurance policies as they did with for-profit insurance corporations. People in noxious industries like coal miners were not, barred from getting health insurance through the IWO. The IWO also had health clinics, optical care clinics, sanitariums for people with TB where they could go to get well. It provided birth control information at a time, by the way, when this was illegal, courtesy of the Comstock laws, but they opened clinics in New York and Cleveland and other places where women could go for maternal care. Now, having said that, and it's interesting because today we're hearing a lot about the need for workers to practice self-care, right? We see a lot of people back in perilous conditions because insurance or unionization rates are so low. But the IWO did all this for its members in a very pragmatic way, but they also were clear. They said this is not the solution. The real solution would be, and Ian, I know you and I are Canadians, so this is shocking to talk about guaranteed government funded health care. The IWO, in, I believe it was 1940, published something called Our Plan for Plenty. And they talked about the need to extend, by that point, Social Security enacted. By the way, many IWO members lobbied their congresspeople to help enact social insurance. Well, they called it social insurance, but what becomes Social Security. But the Plan for Plenty said this is a good start, but it has to continue. We need guaranteed health care, government funded for all United Statesians, right? Not even just for our members in the IWO. We need what today is called a guaranteed wage, national annual wage. We need fully funded government, publicly available hospitals throughout the country. So they had this wonderful brochure showing a worker with a cornucopia, right? Our Plan for Plenty, right? We can do this in America coming out of the Great Depression. So the IWO, what it did for its members was very needed, but they saw it as the base, I would say, for something that had to be built in a social democratic way in throughout the country. And yeah, so that's what they were up to with these programs for their members.
I would simply add to this, one of the things that's fun about working with these archives is you could be reading a political journal In the middle of the political journal, there's a dental column about your dentures and what to do with them, or how to get your TB screening. They're mixing it up. They don't see much difference between what we might call politics, because they clearly had a political arm, as well as what we might call the insurance actuarial fraternal arm. They separated them out financially and otherwise. But even the political publications, you can't get away from the dentist.
Yeah. And just as far as the actuarial stuff too, when they did get in trouble with the state of New York, an accountant from Newark, New Jersey, EA Newark, wrote an affidavit to the court saying, look, they have invested in government securities. They are the most financially stable insurance company. They have reserves above 200% of what they need to cover their members. And on the other hand, the IWO was very scrupulous at making sure they were not, just throwing money at anyone who came to them. It's kind of sad in a way. Sometimes they would say, I'm sorry, your policy doesn't cover what you're asking, but then they would point people to other things. There was what was called the Joseph Brodsky Memorial Fund for hardship cases. Brodsky had been international labor defense lawyer and then the attorney for the IWO. After he died, they set up a fund as kind of let's cover members, even if their policies don't cover their needs. And they had other kind of ways to make sure people wouldn't fall through the cracks. But they were very scrupulous at making sure that this was run, even though some of the officials, like Elissa said, were communists. They had a head for business, and they wanted to make sure this insurance arm of the IWO would thrive and not go belly up financially.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to and also see this at work in all the different studies in this volume, just in terms of like the ways that the organization provided these almost like I might call it like quotidian sort of experiences and needs to its members, right? That would have made it such an attractive organization to involve in. And another element of that, of course, is and I see this in a lot of the studies, is a cultural arm, if you will, of the IWO, and the ways that it helped working class people form community through things like summer camps for kids, and musical productions and dramatic productions and the like. So I wondered if you could each sort of maybe speak to the way the volume highlights some of those sort of cultural arms, if you will, of the IWO's work, and then thinking about more broadly too, perhaps about what this means in terms of kind of representing a cultural front, if you will, from this period.
So briefly said, because Bob and I love to elaborate on each other's comments, as you can tell. If you look at the old left, because that's what we're talking about, they were very committed to this thing. We call it in Yiddish and German Kulturarbeit, or cultural work. And it's not just the question of enlisting big names like on the football field, right? It's a question of how each of the societies maintains its own culture, propagates it, replicates it, reshapes it into naturalized identities. So there could be a naturalized identity called Jewish and worker, or Italian and worker, or Black or African American, or Negro, to use the term of the day. And when you have these identities that are shifting and being formulated strongly, you end up with the importance, not just of the cultural glue, but the importance of performance and how this culture is understood. So we have figures like Langston Hughes that we highlight in the book, Paul Robeson on the Yiddish-speaking, and we also have other figures. And we end up with an enormous number of people who are absolutely devoted to the question of how you do culture within one's own group and extend that IWO umbrella so that it covers the other groups and allows people to come together in certain things. Now, Robeson's a great example of that because he's interested in pageants and operettas and cantatas, and those things are more popular form of highbrow, middlebrow music. So in Ballad for Americans, you end up with something that brings in at Radio City Music Hall, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And so you have this wonderful mix of culture that touches on America, brings it in, but also in effect puts the ethnic culture on parade and ties it back to the American roots, which arguably, as Bob and I have noted, Chaim Solomon, who was the financier of the American Revolution and who was notably Jewish, or Kosciuszko, who was notably also nobility, were not exactly your typical Americans. And yet we find that there's resort to them as well in this question of joining with America, bringing it in and bringing the ethnic into America. It's a fascinating mix.
Yeah, and just in general, I think all of these groups and most lodges, and whether you were Italian, Jewish, African American, Spanish, it was called the Cervantes Society, primarily on the East Coast, Puerto Rican, in the California and Texas region, Mexican American members of the IWO. They all had choirs, bands, drum and bugle corps, theater groups, pageantry, and it created a kind of solidarity. If you organize and play together, right, you're probably going to be more prone to be there when they say, "Hey, we need you to come out and picket in solidarity on a union line, or engage in leafleting for one of our other campaigns." But I think it was a way of all these groups at a time when white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, broadly speaking, said, and boy, it's a good thing we don't do this in 2026 America, he says sarcastically. These groups aren't real Americans, whether they're Jewish or certainly Black or Hispanic or East European. And it was a way of saying, no, we have a culture in which to be proud of, but also to celebrate this kind of multi-ethnic Americanism that was being built, as we said, through things like the CIO. So every one of these groups, participated in, if you were Ukrainian, there were dance troupes and, mandolin societies for Jews, but also Italians, but they would patronize each other's performances too. And again, when we get to that moment of McCarthyism, people are sending affidavits defending the IW, saying, look, I learned about other cultures. Isn't that what Americanism is supposed to be about? Well, the people they were arguing for a multicultural America probably didn't agree. And some of it was, you could argue, kind of prosaic, but it did build a kind of solidarity. There was an IWO bowling league in North Chicago, and you see people with Ukrainian names, Jewish names, Italian names, but they organized campaigns to integrate the bowling alleys in Chicago, which was a pretty big thing in 1946. They passed out petitions getting people to defend the Stockholm Peace Pledge when, there was a campaign to put the atomic and nuclear weapons under the UN authority to get the U.S. To demilitarize, I guess you'd say. They also, in between frames at the bowling alley, passed out leaflets for Henry Wallace when he ran in 1948. So again, using culture as an entry point, right, for these other campaigns, it was quite big. And in the book, yes, we talk about Robeson. He sang and performed at multiple IWO events, including at a camp, Wochika, Workers' Children's Camp for IWO families. We talk about Langston Hughes, who, courtesy of his friend, Louise Thompson Patterson, got involved with the IWO. And the IWO published some of his chapbooks. The IWO had what was called the Harlem Suitcase Theater, in which IWO members performed plays, Don't You Want to Be Free, written by Langston Hughes. And of course, it's cool to see the big names, but I like to think about the people in the IWO. We don't know their names, right? But they were African-American amateur actors who got this opportunity, or they were campers who got to sing with Paul Robeson, courtesy of the IWO. I mean, that's not just about recreation, it's about something bigger, I would argue.
I would add to this that the IWO, uniquely for its day, and it's something we should be thinking about today, tied together the question of anti-Semitism, Jim Crow and lynching, and anti-immigrant xenophobia. They said the three were tied at the hip. We have tons of formulations in English as well as other languages showing that this was a central tenet to the IWO, and they thought of this thing we call the cultural front and cultural performance as a way of bridging that gap, a way of bringing those cultures together and letting people see others as equally American, equally human. And that is no small thing. Having said that, in terms of camps, Camp Kinderland, or children's camp, which Wochika was eventually put into, celebrated its 100th anniversary recently and is going strong. So I personally wish them up to the traditional 120 and more. And there is also other types of persistence that we can see with the Jewish young folk singers. When I interviewed at Yiddish New York and had to present, there's a very famous folk singer who was part of the Jewish young folk singers. Her name is Ethel Ream. And she said, I grew up in a bubble, meaning Kinderland, the Coops, everything else. And of course I went to Smithsonian Records and worked there and put out all this stuff, and then went on to found the Balkan Arts Center, the Penny Whistlers, and as well as the Center for Traditional Music. She simply saw it as a continuation of what she had been given when she was younger and could now run with in different directions because it was so open to other cultures, even though she was so deeply immersed in her own and bilingual.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about, as you said too, those like the way that things have continued in some respects, out of the work of the IWO, and so much of it rooted in the kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic sort of connections that the organization made both implicitly and explicitly within its work. And I think something that I would be curious to touch on is just because there have been a lot of histories written about, for example, the radical left in America and the left in this period is in its relationship with internationalism, right? And I'm wondering, how the IWO, obviously it's in the name, International Workers Order, but how did internationalism play in its programs, both, I guess at the federal level and within the different chapters across the country?
Yeah, well, and again, for your viewers, we're talking in such a broad way. Maybe I hope you all pick up the book. By the way, I'm obligated to say that some of the things I want to talk about later, appear in a tangential way. But the biggest example, of course, in the lifetime of the IWO was the defense of the Republic of Spain in the 36 to 39 Civil War. And we have a chapter of just, I think, one of the better, well, they're all good, of course. I like all my children, haha. But the IWO sent money. They raised and bought an ambulance for the Loyalist government, but they sent, like a lot of the left, hundreds in the IWO, young men to go and fight, and tragically, in some cases, die in the defense of Spain against Franco and his good friends Mussolini and Hitler. And so the IWO was raising money and telling people in America, by the way, even in 32, 33, they're warning people about the rise of fascism in the rest of Europe and trying to get a boycott campaign against Hitler's Germany, which doesn't succeed. But when the Spanish Civil War breaks out, people from New York, including, well, not just New York, but including some people who are back to the entertainment aspect, they had a theater troupe in New York called the Convulsionaries. They were, I guess today we'd say, stand-up comics, but they were also leftist, and they wanted to go and defend Spain. Tragically, one of them was killed on the battlefield. But that's, their high point. They also, of course, once the war, World War II, that is, comes, after June 41, the IWO is very determined to get America to support the war against fascism. And once we join the war in December, right, the IWO organizes, today we'd say, care packages. It was called the Frontline Fighters Fund, where, cigarettes, maybe not the best thing, but cigarettes and socks and food packages are sent to soldiers. They raise money and bond rallies. Every organization has, an honor roll of the IWO members who are overseas fighting. And then it continues, of course, after World War II. One of the first meetings or annual conventions, I guess, after the war also has a Win the Peace campaign attached to it, and they pass resolutions, decolonization in Indonesia, decolonization in India, decolonization in, today we'd call it Vietnam, but they said Indochina. And people like Robeson, an IWO member, were very clear that the fight against Jim Crow at home was linked to a fight against colonization or colonialism in the rest of the world. So the IWO was an international looking organization as well on these kind of issues. Sometimes they had a willing ear from decision makers in Washington. After World War II, increasingly less so.
I would add to this, there are inherent tensions that happen when you have 15 languages and groups plus the English lingua franca. And one of the tensions we can see in this question that we both deeply believe informs the IWO is a type of transnationalism from below, meaning that they're acutely attuned to the world around them outside of the US. And they're interested in North Africa, has to do first with Mussolini, for instance, and his invasion of Ethiopia and Somalia. And by the time he gets to Spain and helping Franco, it's clear it's all hands out, on board on this one. Now, does that differ from the party line? No. But having said that, you can see the stakeholders and the articulations are very deep on this question of Mussolini and Franco. There's also the question of what happens when you get the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? So we have a year and a half, so to speak, in which there are very real divisions within the IWO not just among its Jewish, Yiddish-speaking members, about what do you do when basically Poland is partitioned, and how it is explained, and that can be uncomfortable territory. Then everybody makes up and kisses, of course, once you have Operation Barbarossa, in which Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and then things come together, and the IWO is arguably at its best in that transnational moment in which it is absolutely leading the fight and giving everything in support of the war effort. It is absolutely an amazing type of literature to read, including some wonderful poems and, let's say, less elegant types of poetry.
Yeah, but I'll just say too, it it was difficult, and we've said it, but I'll say it again. Many of the leaders of the IWO were party members, and by the way, it wasn't a secret. People like Max Bedocht, who for 13 years was general secretary of the IWO, he ran for senator from the state of New York. His name was on the ballot, Communist Party, right? So they weren't Pacha, Haynes and others, they weren't spies for the Soviet Union or anything like that. But there were members who were totally, to say disillusioned, understates it, by Molotov-Ribbentrop. But they were determined. They said the IWO is our organization. We're going to stay in it and argue that this was a foolish policy. Conversely, other people like Louise Thompson Patterson was herself a communist. She was making speeches saying, look, we're saying, people are telling us that Great Britain is fighting to defend democracy. She says, I have a very hard time as an African American saying that to people from Jamaica or India. And of course, we know Britain post-World War II did not let those colonies go gently. So there was a lot of tension, right? But there were people who were determined to stay in the organization and make it work. Yes, it got a lot easier after the U.S. entered the war, and some of these frictions were papered over. But they weren't naive about who their ally, Great Britain, shall we say, was. Another man, I'll just throw him in there, Stanley Novak, who was from Detroit, was head of the Michigan State IWO, Polish-American elected official, by the way. He had a radio program in Detroit, and one of his broadcasts, now, Polski, is we now have the Atlantic Charter. That's wonderful, but it remains to be seen. Is this going to apply to India? Mr. Churchill will have to answer. So there were a lot of international questions in which the IWO weighed in on.
And we have a chapter on, if you'll permit me, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, it's fine. Please go ahead.
We have a chapter on W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, you would say that sounds odd at first glance, but then it comes right back to the question you asked about internationalism and civil rights and who are the precursors. And it's an older Du Bois, right? Because, there's always the canard that it's the young who love the left, and, when you get older, you sort of leave it behind. But it's Du Bois who becomes increasingly radicalized because he's interested in nuclear disarmament. And he figures out his friends are not among the talented 10th, typically, and is very interested in his friend Louise Thompson Patterson and the others around her, including Herb Aptheca, who will defend him, or Vito Marcantonio. So we find there are people who drift at a later stage into this IWO orbit, in this case into a publication called Jewish Life, whose current manifestation is called Jewish Currents. But we find that happening as well. And it's fascinating because I would be the first to say you go into an archive, you may have some expectations, but you have to be open-minded that you will find things you don't expect. And that is the pleasure of this particular confiscated archive and the donations that have been made to the Kiel Center and elsewhere.
Yeah, it sounds like a truly wonderful archive, and it is really striking to think about the ways that the IWO was able to sustain these positions from within its members, and having figures like Du Bois and Robeson, big names obviously on histories of the Black radical left and the radical left in general in America. But I'm struck as well by your comments earlier too, Lisa, about the tensions both internal to the organization, coming through the Second World War period, but also in the aftermath of the Second World War, and this kind of looking towards, what leads perhaps to the dissolution of the organization, ultimately in the context of the McCarthyist 1950s. And I'm wondering how we get to that point, and if maybe you could touch on a couple examples from the book, from some of the studies, because I know that some of them touch on that question explicitly.
Bob, you want to go first? Or?
Sure. I said this in a different venue. I forget now which one. In retrospect, I'm amazed that the IWO lasted 24 years, which it did. And I'd say that about a lot of the other institutions like those workers' schools, which had a good run. But they were always, in the crosshairs of conservative Americans. Okay, what base, and by the way, I use the phrase too, but every time we think about anti-communism, we say McCarthyism. Well, he was a latecomer to this and more of a demagogue, right? There were plenty of other people doing this sort of stuff. In the case of the IWO, as early as 1938, the state of Massachusetts tried to take away its insurance license. Now, as we said, its main reason for existing, or at least its first reason for existing, was to write life insurance, accident insurance policies, health insurance. And so they needed to be licensed in various states, or they would not be able to run their business there. Massachusetts argued that they had lied on their application, and they said, well, we're not a political organization, we're not radicals, we're not, up to no good. A court case was held. The man I mentioned, Joseph Brodsky, defended in Massachusetts State Supreme Court, and he argued, well, yes, we do lobby on political issues, but that is a separate fund, and members are asked to donate if there's going to be, a contribution for a Social Security campaign or whatever. Their membership policy money is separate and is not touched. And so they argued basically on matters of social importance, like other organizations, other insurance companies, we have a right to lobby. They were found to be okay. Brodsky warned, though, the national leadership. He said, we have to remain, his phrase I'm paraphrasing, like Caesar's wife, above reproach. We have been given a warning, and we are going to be the kind of organization that engages in these lobbying campaigns. We've been warned, so let's make sure we don't ever step over this. Brodsky died in, I believe, 1947, so he wasn't around for the actual liquidation of the IWO. They also were brought before Martin Dee's House Un-American Activities Committee in 1938. And J. Edgar Hoover had voluminous files on them. And by the way, also had his list of people who, in the event of the president declaring a national security emergency, there was going to be a preventive detention of people who might, and the phrase was might or possibly, probably, words of that nature, be a threat to America. Not anything they actually did, and we will round them up into preventive detention, prisons. ICE comes to mind, right? Vito Marcantonio, a vice president of the IWO, the head of their Garibaldi Society for Italian Americans, and a congressman, a sitting elected congressman, was on the list, right, to be rounded up. So they always had people who didn't like what they were doing. They didn't like, like I say, the civil rights activism, the interracial nature of the society. And yes, they were about 10% of the members. There were about 188,000, maybe 15, 18,000 party members. They always had, these problems potentially looming over them. After World War II, and your listeners probably know, in December 1947, the Attorney General issued what he called the Attorney General's List of Subversive Organizations. Hundreds of various organizations were on this list. The IWO, all of its ethnic societies, the Douglas Lincoln Society for African Americans, the Slovak Workers Society, the Jewish People's Fraternal Organization, and after that, it became a death by 1,000 cuts. This was used ultimately by the state of New York to say, we cannot allow you to do insurance business in New York because you are a moral and political hazard. Well, what does that mean? They said, well, you're on the Attorney General's list. You might be diverting funds to the Soviet Union or to the Communist Party. No proof, no evidence, just you might. And the fact that the Attorney General thinks you're a subversive organization, we call you a moral and political hazard. Now, in insurance law, a hazard of an organization is an organization that's actuarially unsound, not enough money, or the president is taking the funds and going to Boca Raton or whatever, right? There's a hazard there from an actuarial point of view. The state of New York said you're a moral and political hazard. A long series of court cases, and by 1954, the Supreme Court of the U.S. agreed with the state courts of New York that yes, in the current political climate, McCarthyism, if you will, by 1953, we're already in the Korean War, the U.S. Declared that the IWO was a moral and political hazard. It was liquidated. Its funds were turned over. Policyholders had an option: cash out your policy, or we'll assign your policy to a for-profit insurance company and dissolve this IWO. So, this is what happened in that era of Red Scare, this organization, which, by the way, the courts admitted they were actuarially sound. They said, you've got a lot of reserves sitting in the bank, but it was used as an argument to say, oh, you got too much money, and it might make its way to Moscow or to William Foster and the U.S. Communist Party. So in this milieu, the U.S. Declared this organization liquidated. And I like the phrase, I don't know if they were thinking, but it has Stalinist kind of, the right used this to liquidate a red organization. And I'll just say, like the IW also said, we're accused of being communists and you're taking our private property, like our assets and our members' assets and other physical property, right? They were ordered to sell some of their halls, right? Because they were part of this communist. And members were told, by the way, by the state of New York, they sent a letter warning people, right? Said, just because now the IW is dissolved, don't affiliate, don't associate, right, with anybody else who was in this organization or else, right? So again, so much for free association rights in the McCarthy era.
I would add to that, and what Bob said was very well said, that the interracial nature of the IWO is salient once you start getting into the vault, the FBI files that Hoover and others maintain on Robeson, the IWO itself. There are numerous references to this, and it scared him, meaning Hoover personally. And we have to remember that Hoover started with the Palmer raids in 1919, the Little Red Scare, whatever you want to talk about. So he has a long history of dealing with what he sees as radical threats. Having said that, one of the irony is, and it's not a delicious one here, is because these actuaries were so careful, how did they invest? And remember, they're coming out of World War II. And this notion they've been accepted as American patriots. And they've been lauded for this and received medals and gone to Madison Square Garden in 1944 and had a hand of a general, been offered to them when they bought aircraft for the Air Force. They think they're accepted, and this comes down as a bit of a surprise to some of the leadership, which thinks they have something called First Amendment rights. Now, their investments were either cash or U.S. savings bonds and a little bit of real estate. So it is absolutely a conservative organization from the fiscal point of view and that of probity. Having said all this, I constantly get asked by people who are quite elderly, what happened to the money? And I don't have a good answer because clearly New York State, when it confiscated, meaning the state insurance department, when it confiscated the files and other assets, in effect, had control over them. We have a situation in which we can say that civil rights was set back, that fiscal probity was punished, that informers were used, and the IWO was brought down deliberately, despite the fact it had Donner and Kenoy and others who defended it in front of the Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds.
I mean, it sounds like the story of a lot of organizations through that period, right? In terms of, even if they had some remote connection with the radical left, there was still the distinct possibility they were going to end up on an attorney general's watch list or called before a Senate committee or a House of Un-American Activity committee, and how widespread this kind of repression was. I mean, you didn't have to be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, obviously, to face that kind of surveillance and repression, right? So, it sounds like the IWO was one of many similar cases of organizations that experienced this kind of repression. And I guess a final question is just to wonder whether is there an outlier element to the IWO in that particular case, or was it more part of the story that has been told about the impact of anti-communism? As Bob, you said, it started much earlier, and Elissa mentioned, of course, Hoover's early days, so there's a long history of repression of people who are represented as radical and or subversive, incorrectly in most cases. But I'm just wondering again, what is there something exceptional about the IWO in how it experiences these repressions, or is it part of something that is this larger story of what happens to so many Americans who had not only radical left perspectives but also kind of liberal perspectives on race, for example, through the middle of the 1950s.
Well,
Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, you have an outlier aspect. It gets brought down under insurance law because you can't sell or offer mutual aid benefits without an insurance license in a state. And they were domiciled in the state of New York, which is where they were founded in 1930. Mm-hmm. So it is a little different from that point of view to come down under insurance law. If we say today that immigration law is a separate set of laws or statutes, that is an understatement. But when you start looking at insurance law, by definition, it is different in each of 50 states. And it is the only instance in which a leftist organization is brought down under insurance law, and as Bob explained, at all the hazard, and then it works its way up through the federal court system, which is more of a pattern that you have just described. Now, as to what else makes it an outlier, is that its membership was incredibly loyal in terms of those policies, because they were hard won, having those benefits. And so there was a policyholders committee that intervenes at every single step. And there are people who actually do what I call spin-offs of almost everything they can to protect it, whether it's Kinderland or something that ends up called the Zhitlovsky Foundation, or Sojourners for Truth for Peace, which is under Louise Thompson Patterson. It's not a spin-off, but it comes out of this world in which the Ingram case and the Scottsdale case, which is not finished yet, are still there. So there are Black women who are marching on Washington and organizing, and they're some of the most famous Black women that are known to US history. And you have all sorts of things that happen that mark it as unique within that larger context.
Yeah, I mean, it is a part of this whole persecution mania toward the left, and broadly defined the left, right? Because people got caught in that net who were not party members. By the way, I just want to say, a dear friend said, we have to use the C word. She can get away with that, being that cheeky. But, you know, I want to push back on, and I'm not saying this is what either of you are doing, but like, oh, well, if innocent people were, you know, caught up in McCarthyism, that's a shame. But communists, right? Well, they were communists who were organizing for civil rights or universal health care or denuclearization of a world, you know, 5 minutes to midnight with the nuclear weaponry that I alluded to with the Stockholm Peace Pledge. So, you know, the organization got caught up in this, whether one was in the party or not. And I think that's what's unique too, that it had members from all walks of life, all racial and ethnic groups, and broadly defined leftists. I mean, they argue in defending themselves, we have some Republican members. Well, it was probably, you know, Dewey, or we used to call them Rockefeller Republicans. They didn't have many right-wingers. They didn't like Trotskyites, for a different talk show. But, you know, people got penalized for being in the IWO, and many of them, I think, felt for doing nothing wrong. What? For wanting affordable insurance and wanting to participate in Mandolin Society or what have you. And so in that respect, I think what is unique is it really knocked the feet out from under this broad-based, multi-racial, multi-ethnic society that was working both on culture and recreation and prosaic things like insurance, but yeah, political lobbying. And it takes a long time, I think, to rebuild some of that infrastructure of if we've ever built it back to what it was in that heyday of the 30s, 40s until about 1950. And in that respect, I think that's what's maybe unique is too strong a word, but important about the IWO. It wasn't just, not that that's not important, a union or just a workers' school or whatever. It was trying to, create this Germans say Vereinswesen, this institutional life, right, of the left.
And I'll add to this, and Bob has heard me say this, though we are not communists, as the word was once understood, meaning in the 1930s. By definition, neither of us were born then.
No, true.
Yeah, we confess to many sins, but that's not one of them. We do see communists as the canaries in the coal mine, because if their First Amendment rights are abridged, what does that say in terms of free speech? When we're not talking about violence, or right? If their free speech and right to association is abridged, what precedent does that set for America back in the day? So we are very interested in that question, and we think it's one that animates much discourse back in the day in the 50s as well as today.
Certainly, I can imagine a number of listeners would see resonance in the current period, in the thinking back on these periods that the studies in your volume cover so well. I'm wondering, as a final sort of question and opportunity to share, whether you each have any thoughts about where studies of the IWO might go after this, in terms of, the different areas that the book covers. I know there's lots on, IWO chapters across the country, but also internationally. And there's, of course, other avenues to explore in terms of the organization's function and what it's done historically. So I wondered if you could each share a bit on that question.
Well, we didn't mention, but you got me thinking. Internationally, we have chapters talking about the South American. It was not IWO, but the IWO was involved in ECUF, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Yiddish culture organization, and they had chapters in Argentina, Brazil, etc. And then we have a colleague writing on the Canadian organization, which was more kind of closely, not exactly the IWO, but UJPO, which, by the way, still exists, which some of the branches or other facilities of the IWO or IWO world, some of them miraculously make it into the 21st century. But I mean, maybe I'd like to see maybe more work on those kind of international left communities. Some of the other branches of societies, right? They called them language federations or national groups, depending on the person talking. But the IWO had 15 of them. Well, it's unfortunate, but I don't speak all 15 of those languages. But I think it would be wonderful if somebody would look more into the Italian branch or the Croatian left in America. I do have a friend in Pennsylvania who's working on the Croatian left, but more of that, out other ethnic groups within the IWO, and broadly defined the left in the 30s through 50s. I think we need to know more about them.
Bob, would it be permissible to discuss a translation of a theater poster that we saw in a photo? We can't explain the photo in the context, and neither of us is very good at Ukrainian Cyrillic, take our word for it. But Bob had a grad student working on this. I have a grad student working on other things who just defended successfully at Cornell. So we believe in grad students working with archive, but the translation we got of the poster had me rolling. Bob, go for it.
Well, I don't remember the precise, but it was a 1929 visit by, was it Saltzman? Yeah, and anyway, this fellow who helps found the IWO a year later, but it was a Ukrainian theater group, and they were doing this play, Welcome Shortwave Radio 477 or something
Four,
like that.
447.
Yeah, 447. And these other plays, right, that are these comedies that, the Soviet theater is doing in Kharkiv in Ukraine. So yeah, it's maybe the bigger point is research has to be collaborative. We need people with Ukrainian to help us out. And yeah, this fellow who was a St. FX student, and now he's getting his PhD and working on Ukrainian lefties. So I reached out to him. But yeah, it's hard to do a synthesis of a multilingual group unless you are yourself multilingual or know somebody.
Right. So Bob is working on workers' schools, and he could tell
Yeah.
you about that. I have tentatively decided my next IWO project has to do with the ILD, or the International Labor Defense, that's run by William Patterson and Vito Marcantonio, because in part we have the upcoming anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. And we have William Patterson as mobilized into the left for the first time because he sees an injustice is about to happen. And we have Vito Marcantonio, who also becomes the head of the ILD. They're both lawyers, so you need legal people, and that becomes the CRC, or the Congress, the Civil Rights Congress, which famously Robeson was lynched in effigy, and Peekskill in the IWO is one of the groups that intervenes on that, and is one of the sponsors of the CRC concert, which was a fundraiser because that is another Cold War tragedy. But I have my geographer's instincts that it's really interesting to look at this question of what the old left sort of sees as a martyrology, and it's broader. We know with Scottsboro, we know with Sacco and Vanzetti, that there is mourning. It's not just Emma Goldman in a Haymarket. There's mourning for people who are seen as martyrs. And how broad that mourning is really interesting in terms of thinking about what the antecedents are of bringing people together and what shared understandings are across groups. So my instincts may be entirely wrong on this, but I suspect that's my next project.
Hmm. And like everybody perhaps on this kind of a Zoom listen, academics or academic adjacent people know it's like going down a rabbit hole, but you find cool stuff and you don't know where it's going to lead you. Yeah, I mean, the worker school, I don't want to, we'll talk about that in 2 or 3 years, maybe, in Allah, inshallah, Allah willing. But I mean, I just saw a little film that a teacher of photography at the Detroit Workers School made, and it was these hunger marches, that were disrupted by Ford's private security people in 32. But in the film, there are people carrying banners, the Lithuanian Workers Choir, and under that it says "Free the Scottsboro Boys," right? And I got to say that's back to the IWO, the topic of this, that kind of solidarity across groups that seem almost by 2026 standards counterintuitive. I don't want to slam Lithuanians, they're nice people, but I think it would be hard to see a Lithuanian fraternal society, imagining in 2020 something, Lithuanian fraternal society, George Floyd needs justice, or something like that, right? We've come to a divide that the IWO said was not natural, was not just, and same with these worker schools and these Lithuanian singing societies, right? They saw injustice, whether it was to Black people, their own people, immigrants, Jews, as unacceptable, and they worked together, and I think that's beautiful. Maybe I romanticize them, but I'll take it over where we've come.
And we're not naive about their politics. So that's why it's historic case studies, and they allow for nuance, For some, they perhaps provide some sort of solace and inspiration because toolkits are needed today that have resonance, but they also have to have accuracy and depth and be able to open up questions. So we didn't look for authors that would agree with each other,
No.
with the exception of our artist, the famous Ben Katcher. And you will notice he did something based on a 1930 photo from Brownsville, Brooklyn, which was very poor in a Jewish neighborhood, among other things, of an IWO headquarters. He added in a statue of Lenin that did not exist on that corner, but he included the Scottsboro stuff.
Yeah.
So we have a wealth of information about how people dealt with these questions that are contentious in terms of identity, in terms of mutuality, in terms of how people work together in allyship. We see clearly Louise Thompson Patterson's hand in much of this. Having said that, we also understand that for a current generation, that opening up the toolbox allows them to make informed judgments when historians and geographers, if I may add, offer it, digitize it, write about it, compliment people, included people who do art history. You'll notice the contributors come from many fields. And that is the pleasure of doing labor history out of archives and interviews and saying, hey, this was important and remains important.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think on that note, I want to thank you, Elissa and Bob, for sharing of your work on this wonderful collection on the IWO. And I hope our listeners were able to get something from this conversation, and I'm sure they did. And I want to wish you the best on your future work, and I'll definitely be checking in myself to see where it goes.
Thanks. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much, Ian. And we look forward to commentary by labor historians and their allies.
Thank you so much.